What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and today we're going to talk through my top 25 running back rankings for fantasy football. As always, we're going to break them down tier by tier, talk about the ceiling, the floor, the range of outcomes for each one of these players so that you guys are ready to go and prepared to win your leagues this summer. As always, if you enjoy, make sure down below, subscribe, leave a like. Let's go.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like I'm frozen.
Now, as always, with these tiers, I feel much stronger about the tiers themselves than I do about the rankings within each tier. This is just how I see the divides and the value pockets in the current running back landscape. Now, these rankings are for half PPR and full PPR fantasy leagues skewed towards redraft managed. So players where you're going to be putting them in your lineup and playing them every week. And first up, we have Christian McCaffrey, the only running back in this tier, the only running back I'm considering at the 101. That's why this tier is named that. Running backs that I would consider at the 101. Right now, McCaffrey's the only one. He was the number one overall player last year with 24 points per game, higher than any quarterback, higher than any wide receiver. He was a monster despite being in year 7, 8, 9 at this point. He was still a monster, and he's still in this 49ers offense that's going to score a lot of points. So it's tough to have him much lower than this. I do get the idea of age cliff is coming for him, father time is coming for him, whatever, but we just saw him gap the field last year. He had 24 points per game, then it was Kyron at like 21, and then RB3 was like Kamara at like 17.9 points per game. So he was giving you like a 6-point per game average or gap on the RB3 and everybody behind him. So it's just this crazy advantage that no team can really replicate, and until he shows us that there's signs of decline or he can't play anymore, we'll move him down accordingly. But for now, McCaffrey has to be at the top of the mountain. Then our next tier is elite RB1s. These are just guys, when we're drafting, most of the time in the first round, early second, when they're in my RB1 spot, it just feels like an elite difference-making option. And first up here, we'll have RB2 Breece Hall. Now, he is coming off RB6 point per game finishes, RB7 point per game finishes the last 2 years as a rookie, and then as a sophomore coming off an ACL tear. And this is all while in an awful situation. I think Warren Sharp outlined this very well. He's had 2 seasons where he has had number 30 and number 29 offensive line and run block win rate, number 31 and number 31 offensive line and injury rate, awful quarterback play, a torn ACL, meniscus, rehab, hamstring, and ankle injuries, and yet he has been a monster. He gained the second most total yards last year behind only CMC. His per-game net yardage ranks number 6 among running backs the last 2 years. He averaged the number 4 highest rate of 15-plus yard gains, the 5th highest rate of 20-plus yard gains. In each game, he averaged 2.75 gains of 10 or more yards, number 3 in the NFL behind only CMC and Nick Chubb. He has been an absolute monster despite a pretty bad situation. But now we have a guy who's going into year 3, and we have Aaron Rodgers coming off an Achilles tear. Hopefully he stays healthy. If he does, this offense should be much better. The offensive line, they add Tyron Smith. They get healthier on the offensive line. They draft Olu Fashanu. The offensive line is now improved. So everything is in place for him to do much better, and he has that crazy ceiling we want from running backs because of the receiving upside. Last year, he led all running backs in PFF receiving grade, receptions, targets, receiving yards, all of that. So the receiving volume is going to be there. The efficiency and the touchdown scoring is now going to be there. Really, the only reason not to draft him is just concerns over the fragility of the situation, which I get, right? We're banking on a 40-year-old off of an Achilles tear. We're banking on Tyron Smith, who misses games every single year. And the Jets are just going to jet, as much as I hate to say it. Then, after that, at our RB3 spot, we have Bijan Robinson. And last year was kind of a disaster for him. He was the best running back prospect since Saquon Barkley. I, like others, thought maybe he could have that Saquon Barkley-type rookie season where you come out there and you light the world on fire. I just talked about Christian McCaffrey's 24-point-per-game season. Saquon did that as a rookie with the Giants. I thought that was in Bijan's range. It didn't work out. Arthur Smith was there. You had, of course, Desmond Ridder. The quarterback room was atrocious. But we get a fresh look here where we get new offensive coordinator Zach Robinson, who comes from the Rams scheme, which of course has made Kyron Williams relevant this past year, Todd Gurley, all of those guys. And a lot of these McVay guys go on to do better things when they get that OC job, like the Matt LaFleur's of the world. And then we get Kirk Cousins, who's also coming off an Achilles tear. So it's going to be an interesting case study of these Achilles tears this year because we don't really know what to expect, but if Kirk Cousins can play and he can elevate this offense and we see a more modern Ram-style offense where we're up-tempo and we're balanced and we're doing play action and we're incorporating motion and all of that, things could look really, really nice for Bijan, who had the third most targets last year with 83. So the receiving upside is there, the talent is there, the situation is now there. The only real concerns is, again, Kirk Cousins' health, but at least Penix behind him should be better, or an upgrade from Desmond Ridder, or an upgrade from Taylor Heineke last year. And then also, the only other thing to look out for is Tyler Algier. How much he's involved, especially at the goal line, will dictate Bijan's ceiling. Then at RB4, we have Jahmyr Gibbs for the Detroit Lions. And last year, after he was fully unleashed, like, people seem to forget, but if you remember that, a lot of people probably started Jahmyr Gibbs week 1. I told a lot of people to draft Jahmyr Gibbs. I got a lot of heat because early on in the season, if you guys remember that Thursday night game, the opener versus the Chiefs, he had like 8 touches and he kind of sucked. And then everyone was like, man, we just drafted this guy in round 3 and we can't put him in his lineup, or in our lineup. Now, here, we get to week 7. I believe a David Montgomery injury happened, and he was fully unleashed from there on out. He had 86% of the snaps that week and was 18.5 point per game from there on as the RB4 in fantasy. Over the entire year, I believe he was more like RB6 with like 16-plus points per game, or like RB7 or 8. That's still really, really good for a rookie running back. And the best part about it is that he hasn't even been unleashed as a receiver yet. He had just 52 catches last year, which is good, but it's not that, Alvin Kamara 80-plus reception type upside that we thought he had coming out of school, because he was actually seen as maybe one of the best receiving prospects ever coming out of Alabama. He had more college career receptions than guys like Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley. The concern was always between the tackles. He's very light, he's frail. How is he going to fare between the tackles? And last year, he was actually a really efficient, explosive between the tackles runner, but actually underperformed his fantasy volume in the receiving game, which is actually kind of exciting. I know that sounds weird to say, but if he can get to 80-plus catches and he can couple the explosive plays that he has in the run game, and he can get that going in the receiving game, which I don't see why there's any reason to think that he shouldn't after we saw from him in college, or we saw from him in year 1. If he can put the two together, then we're talking about a massive 20-plus point per game ceiling for a guy that doesn't even have to hit like 1,000 receiving yards, kind of like what Kamara used to do in his prime, where he wouldn't even hit 1,000 rushing yards. He would just be a monster in the receiving game, score touchdowns, give you big plays. Jahmyr Gibbs could be that. And then we can also fall back on the idea that he was RB8 in points per game. I meant to say that earlier. RB8 in points per game with the healthy David Montgomery. If David Montgomery's the same as he was last year, and it's the same sort of split, RB8 in points per game is something you can fall back on in a really good offensive system with Ben Johnson, with one of the best offensive lines in football, and they're going to score a ton of points. So there's a lot of insulation there, and there's a lot of upside with the receiving. Then at RB5, we have Jonathan Taylor. And I have him still in this tier. I still do really like Jonathan Taylor. Last year we were drafting him in the first round until, it was just an insane offseason for Jonathan Taylor. He find himself in an RV with Jim Irsay, and they can't get a contract done, so he puts himself on the pup. Maybe he had an ankle issue, maybe he didn't, and then he comes in, and just as he's starting to get into his groove, he gets hurt. He tears a ligament in his thumb, and then he does end the year on a crazy, crazy game where he puts up 30 carries for over 100 yards. It looks like vintage Jonathan Taylor. But that's really all we have to go off of going into this year. But now he's going to be fully healthy. Zach Moss is gone. And I get that Jonathan Taylor doesn't have the receiving upside as the other 3 running backs in this offense, but we've still seen him, or the other 3 running backs in this tier, but we've still seen him hit that 20-plus point per game ceiling on just 40 receptions before. So I think it's still in Jonathan Taylor's reach. And what we have working for us here is that, yes, Anthony Richardson will limit the amount of checkdowns that we see, and he will take some goal line rush attempts away. We have seen with Shane Steichen in the past, when he had Jalen Hurts, when he had Miles Sanders, both of those guys were top 5 in rush attempts inside of the 10-yard line. So Jonathan Taylor might not lead the league in percentage of the inside the 10 attempts, but he's still going to get a lot of them because it's going to be a run-heavy offense. They're going to run inside of the red zone. And after Anthony Richardson got hurt last year, they're not going to want to use Richardson as their battering ram on the goal line in a week 9 game against the Jaguars or something. It just doesn't make sense. Jonathan Taylor is going to get the goal line work. It's not going to be a high percentage, but it's going to be a high volume. And to me, I think that he has that ceiling. He's still in his prime. He's just 25 years old. I don't see that he has fallen off yet. The Colts are heading in the right direction under Steichen. Their offensive line is getting better. Everything is there for Jonathan Taylor to have a nice 18-plus point per game season, 20-plus point per game season, and be a really strong RB1. Now, after that, we have our low floor RB1s. These are guys you're drafting as your RB1, but the floor just seems very shaky. And that is especially true with Devin Achane. And this is the lowest I can put Devin Achane. I know that this is probably the highest you'll see him in rankings, but I refuse to not be all in on a running back that looks the part of the next Chris Johnson, the next Jamal Charles, just fantasy football god. That's what he has in terms of his upside at this point. And we talk every offseason about legendary upside, right? If we're going to draft a running back early, we want them to have the upside to break fantasy. And I can't think of someone with a better chance to break fantasy than Achane. He was the RB5 in points per game last year as a rookie with Raheem Mostert in that same backfield. So he didn't even get a full volume or full workload there. He was still the RB5 in points per game on just the RB32 volume in expected points per game. Now, on one hand, you can say, well, that's going to regress. But on the other hand, that RB5 points per game is including the week 1 and week 11 games where he played under 10% of the snaps. So you can be like, oh, well, the 50-point game is really boosting that number up. Well, the 2 games where he left early also bringing that number down. And on top of that, we should see more volume, right? He was just a rookie last year. Heading into year 2, you're going to get more volume. This is a guy who rushed for over 1,000 yards in the SEC. I know that he is 188 pounds. He's a little bit frail, but he can take on carries. Of course, he's not going to get to 20 carries a game, 20 touches per game, but he can get into that Kamara sweet spot we've seen in the past where he can get 15, 16, 17 touches, a lot in the receiving game, a lot in the rushing game, and give you a ton of efficiency. Where, again, we've already seen a top 5 finish on RB3 of volume as a rookie. And now we're getting hype out of Miami's camp where you can see here, this is a quote about Devin Achane. My God, Devin Achane's going to have a monster year. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere. This guy is doing so much with his game, his usage in the passing game, how he himself circled that as something he can improve upon, get more of a piece of a pie of this dynamic offense that is oodles, that has oodles and oodles of skill players who can beat you and burn you and score on you. I just think Achane, maybe he's the receiver 3. I'm watching this guy line up in the slot and run a slot fade and cook a corner. The pacing, the lineup, the stem, the explosive step to widen and then cut back inside. He looks like a receiver when he's playing the position. He just looks like that. This might be the next Christian McCaffrey in terms of overall versatility and general usage, pass game, run game. He's just a big play waiting to happen, and it's totally wild and something I haven't seen before. Tyreek Hill changed the way I view NFL practices. Devin Achane, as far as running back goes, has done the same thing. I think he can challenge every level of the field as a pass catcher, the timing, the pacing, the explosion as a runner. He just keeps making play after play no matter how you get him the football. Run an actual route from the slot. Okay, run a route from the perimeter. Okay, I can do that. This guy's going to be a freaking superstar. I don't know what else to tell you. He's one of the best players on the field of a team that I think is one of the 5 best teams in the NFL. Devin Achane, breakout superstar of the year. Now, I know that was long-winded, but if that doesn't make your pants tight about a potential league-winning running back, I don't know what will. This is, again, a guy in a Mike McDaniel offense that has been high-scoring the last 2 years. It's been high efficiency the last 2 years. And the only running back in front of him is Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert at this point is a 32-year-old running back that finished as a top 24. He finished as a top 5 running back last year, but it was the first time that he ever finished inside the top 24 running backs in points per game. Now he's heading into his age 32 season. He also never had a year with double-digit touchdowns. He scored 20 of them last year. So it's this outlier season for Raheem Mostert. He's now 32, which when we talk about running backs, right, Christian McCaffrey's at the top here, and he's in his late 20s. And there's running backs from this draft class, Leonard Fournette, Kareem Hunt, who are dust now. So now we're talking about a 32-year-old running back potentially falling off the age cliff, potentially passing the baton to Devin Achane, who was the more explosive and the better runner last year. And with Devin Achane, I know it's tough in terms of, well, you can't project Raheem Mostert to get hurt. And when you do projections, it's tough to give Achane all this volume, and it's tough to get him to match his. I think that he broke the record for the highest yards per carry in a given season last year. And I get that in terms of projections, and when you think through it all, it's tough to get him to the number that makes sense. But again, we've already seen him finish as a top 5 running back in points per game as a rookie on low volume. If he can get that volume ticked up, I'm not talking about 20 touches per game. Again, I'm just talking about if he can just flirt with RB1 usage, he can give you so much point per game on top of that he can break 20-plus points per game on not the same kind of usage that a guy like Saquon, who we'll talk about in a second here, might command. You can get him like 15 touches per game, and that can be enough for him to break fantasy because we look at fantasy points over expected per game. I look through all the way back to 2009. Devin Achane is one of 7 rookie running backs since 2009 to hit 3+ fantasy points over expected per game. So guys that had their expected volume and then outscored that by 3 or more fantasy points per game. The 6 other running backs to do so all went on to hit 20-plus points per game in their second year. You have Kamara, Zeke Elliott, Arian Foster, Kareem Hunt, David Johnson, and Jonathan Taylor. They all came out the other side and were amazing. And there were questions about Kamara, right? Kamara was in the same backfield as Mark Ingram. Can he replicate what he did in his first year? Same thing with a guy like Kareem Hunt. I'm sure that there was questions with Arian Foster as well, where he came out the next year. It was an absolute monster. Again, I can't outline the exact way that HN does it. Maybe he gets more receptions. Maybe he gets more carries. Whatever it is, I want to be all in on the guy that set the record for the highest FPOE per game last year, a special talent heading into his second year, which is usually the year for these running backs, right? You can think David Johnson in year 2. You can think Le'Veon Bell in year 2. All of these guys, Christian McCaffrey in year 2 was an absolute monster. Why not Devin HN in a really good environment and a really good offense, and Mike McDaniel can use him in the best way possible. Now, of course, he's a little fragile, 188 pounds. He missed games last year, but running backs as a whole get hurt. They deal with their injuries. It's low floor RB1s for a reason. If there wasn't a size concern, if there wasn't an injury concern, he's someone that could be going up here. Now, I didn't mention Jalen Wright, but to me, Jalen Wright's going to be the RB3 in kind of a redshirt season. He's just going to fill in when either Mostert or HN miss time. Now, after that, we have our RB7 with Saquon Barkley. Now, people probably want to put him higher than this. It's tough for me. We're now heading into year 7 with Saquon Barkley, and we haven't gotten a 20-plus point per game season, which is what I'm looking for with these running backs. Right? I know that there was only 2 last year, but if you had Kyron, if you had Christian McCaffrey, if you had one of the 2, you had a really good shot at winning your league. Right? That is a huge, huge advantage to have on your team. A running back that is 20-plus points per game, competing with the receivers, competing with the quarterbacks, especially in an age right now where that's rare among running backs. Saquon at this point, again, he hasn't hit 20-plus points per game since his rookie year. He's basically a volume play, which really scares me. When we talk about a running back that's past his prime and we're really only betting on him because of his role and not because of talent, that's where it gets scary. Now, he's going to get a lot of volume. When we talk about Mike Clay projections, he does the projections over at ESPN. He's very good at what he does in terms of weighted opportunities per game. So this weights targets more than carries. He is projected for the 4th most in the NFL, the only guy above 18-plus, alongside Bijan, Breece, and McCaffrey. So you can only put that guy so low. He's going to get 18-plus weighted opportunities per game. He's going to probably give you like 16 to 18 points per game as like his last ride. You know, he's coming from the Giants. He has chips on his shoulder. He's going to try very hard, or they're going to give him a lot of opportunity. But at the end of the day, I don't know how we get to a spot where like Saquon's the 101 in 2025. I don't know how we get to a spot where he's like, you know, like I just said, 101 in 2025, massive, massive league winner. You're drafting him highly next year, but he can probably, again, give you like 16 to 18 points per game. He's going to get squeezed from both sides of Jalen Hurts taking rushing touchdowns and then also him not checking down as much. We saw last year with DeAndre Swift. I actually wrote this up later in this video. DeAndre Swift, it was his first year outside of the top 10 in target share last year with Jalen Hurts. So there's going to be less reception upside, going to be less touchdown upside. It's going to be good efficiency because it'll be his best offensive line he's had. I'm sure he'll have big chunk plays, but I have a hard time seeing how he's just like this massive, massive winner. I think that he's probably like a double if he ends up hitting right. But with running back scarcity, if he hits 18 points per game and is like the RB3 on the season, he's a good pick. So this is about as low as I can put him. Then we have Travis Etienne as my RB8 here. And this is a running back that finished at the RB7 in points per game last year, despite the Jaguars falling apart. Towards the end of the year, Trevor Lawrence got banged up, offensive line got banged up, and it was just awful. He was behind a bottom 6 offensive line in terms of PFF run block grade and ESPN run block win rate, and even still, he gave you the RB7 in point per game finish. Now he comes into this year showing that he can take on the volume, he can catch the passes. He had a ton of catches last year. I want to say he had over 50 after that being a question mark after year 1. And they added nobody. They added Kalen Robinson in the draft, and they added Dearness Johnson. Tank Bigsby was one of the worst rookies in the NFL last year. So there's no one behind him. The volume is still locked in. When we look at Mike Clay's projections, he has ETN for the 8th most weighted opportunities per game, behind JT, Kamara, Rashad White, but ahead of guys that you guys are probably screaming at your TV right now or your laptop or phone of Derrick Henry, Pacheco, Kyron Williams. They're all below him in terms of volume, and this should be a really good bounce-back candidate offense where we could see Trevor Lawrence truly dominant year. And Connor Allen has this great tweet that I really recommend checking out. He took the look-ahead line. So he took sportsbooks put out already their over-unders and their betting lines for every game. He then took that and extrapolated it out to see what does Vegas have in terms of highest scoring offenses. Well, they have the Jaguars 15th, right? That's pretty dang good, right? For a team that was probably outside the top 20 in scoring last year, that is really solid. So they're going to be average to above average in terms of scoring. The offense should take a step forward. They added a little bit to the offensive line. They got Mitch Morse, center from the Bills. They should get additional health from guys like Cam Robinson and I think Anton Harrison. We're getting deep in the weeds with the offensive line. I think Anton Harrison, rookie for them, really bumpy year last year. We could see him take a step forward in year 2. So there's reasons to buy in on this offense again. Also last year, you could have had some stacked boxes where Calvin Ridley wasn't effective, Christian Kirk was hurt, and it was a lot of Evan Ingram in the shallow. We'll kind of see what that looks like this year with field stretchers and Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis, but I'm all in on Travis Etienne this year. Should be a lot of volume, should be a lot of points. And he balled out last year, and he's also still in the prime of his career. He's like 25, 26 years old. Then we have Kyren Williams. We'll put him at the RB9. And I get wanting to put him higher. Again, these tiers are just tiers. So if you want to put him at the top end of this tier, you absolutely can. But for me, I'll have him at RB9. He just feels, again, this is a low floor RB1 tier. Feels extremely fragile. This is a guy that was a day 3 pick, and I always get those flashbacks. I know we talked about Arian Foster with H.N., but outside of Arian Foster, you're looking at like Jordan Howard and Phil Lindsay and James Robinson and Alfred Morris, of just guys that were day 3 picks or undrafted. They ball out in year 1. They're waiver wire winners in year 1. And then their teams just discard them. We already kind of see the Rams discard Kyren Williams a little bit by drafting Blake Corum on day 2. That's meaningful draft capital in this environment right now where Rondre Stevensons of the world are going in the 4th round and running backs slip to day 3 all the time. That's meaningful draft capital that they spent on a running back because Kyren Williams, 1, doesn't have a ton of investment, and 2, is sub 200 pounds and already has a pretty ugly injury history. Where this is a tweet from Edwin Porras. He's the injury guy over at Fantasy Points. He does great work. He said, Kyren is here for a good time, not a long time. Williams now with his 3rd ankle/foot injury in 2 years. Managers should consider moving him to a safer guy. This is from, October 23rd. But now, May 21st, Kyren Williams missed the entire spring with a foot issue. So he already has foot issues for a guy that broke his foot as a rookie and got put on IR, and then last year missed 4 games with a sprained ankle, I believe. Edwin Porras now says Kyren Williams' feet and ankle issues, not ideal. And he's usually someone that's not squeamish about, like, he was a very big proponent of Saquon Barkley is not injury prone, go draft him, whatever. Same thing with Breece Hall last year. He was all in on Breece Hall. Even him, he is a bit concerned with the Kyren stuff because, again, we're talking sub 200 pounds. We're talking foot injury in year 1 that put him on IR. We're talking ankle injury in year 2 that put him out, where we had Royce Freeman and Darrell Henderson out there. And then this year, we already have a foot injury early season. And that's always so scary to me. I've learned over the years to just stop discarding where, oh, well, he had a little tweak here in June. He'll be fine by week 1. Almost always, it's like, man, I just wish I never drafted that guy. So I want to have Kyren in a spot where I'm not going to take him a ton. I get it if you want him. He was the only running back last year not named McCaffrey to hit 20-plus points per game. He's going to be in a good offense. McVay likes to use their RB1, but there is the downside of the injury. There's downside of day 3 pick gets discarded. There's downside of Kyren Williams plays, gets hurt. Blake Corum comes in, smashes, and then Blake Corum just doesn't give that job back to Kyren Williams, or he makes it an actual split. Like, there's a lot more up in the air at this point with Kyren Williams. So he is a low floor RB1. I completely get it, but it does just feel like drafting last year's league winner and not projecting forward to 2023. So that's where I'm at with Kyren Williams right now. And then we have Isaiah Pacheco. Similar story of like a day 3 guy that could get discarded here, but this team didn't draft Blake Corum on day 2. They also didn't re-sign Jerick McKinnon, and there's a lot to hold on to of what Pacheco did down the stretch last year of why you should be drafting. These are 2 good tweets from Jacob Gibbs and Ryan Heath here. Pacheco without Jerick McKinnon last year, 14.9% target share, 22.1 points per game. After the bye, Pacheco's red zone attempt share grew from 56.8%, 14th in the NFL, to 80.4% second. Only Kyren Williams had more fantasy points per game in the red zone than Pacheco from weeks 10 through 18. Then we have Jacob Gibbs here. If looking for evidence that suggests Isaiah Pacheco may take on an expanded role in year 3, KC outlined it in 4 playoff games. A 74% snap rate, 57% route participation, 20 rushes per game, and a 48% red zone opportunity rate. All of those numbers are really, really strong. So we saw without McKinnon, they fully unleashed him to 20-plus points per game. Then in the playoffs, they rode him in their Super Bowl run. So that has to stand for something. And now, after being the RB14 in points per game last year, I think I'm probably too low on Isaiah Pacheco here, where he's now going to be the lead running back for the Chiefs. They have one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. They're going to score a ton of points. They are the Chiefs. They always do that. And Pacheco is going to be the lead guy. Outside, McKinnon's not on the roster, so now you're talking like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, talking like Deneric Prince, the like rugby kid that they got as well. There's really no one behind him, which does give me red flags of like, you're drafting for a role, you're drafting because of an empty depth chart. When we're talking about the Chiefs, and remember when Andy Reid, I remember back in the day when we were drafted Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the first round, was look at Andy Reid RB1s, right? We know Kareem Hunt, we know Brian Westbrook, all of these guys who were monsters in fantasy. That all applies to Pacheco, so he could be an absolute monster. And again, we already saw it down the stretch last year of what it looked like when you increased his workload. Now, after that, we have our last running back in this tier, and that's Derrick Henry. Another fragile bet. I get the situation's amazing. Last year, we had Derrick Henry finish as the RB16. So now we're having him at the RB11 here. It was his first time outside of the top 12 since 2018. So now we're starting to see a little bit of a decline. But I will say, to his defense, the Titans were awful. Their offensive line was terrible. The whole situation was awful. And he was still efficient. He still had a positive FPOE per game. So I don't think that Derrick Henry's washed or that he's fallen off. But we now get him on a team with the Ravens. We're projected for the 7th most points in the NFL. We just saw Gus Edwards have a monster season there with like 13 touchdowns. We could very much see Derrick Henry do the same thing. But here's the thing. Derrick Henry already had like 280 carries last year and 12 touchdowns. Lamar's there. He's going to take some rushing touchdowns. You can, if you want to project Derrick Henry like 15 touchdowns and like 5 yards per carry, if you put that onto last year, that would have only have been 17 PPR points per game, which is fine. But Derrick Henry's going to go in the second round of your home league. He's going to go in the second round of your office league, whatever. That is a really rich price for a guy with a ceiling of 17 points per game who's age 30 at this point, coming off of a down fantasy production year, and also getting towards the end of the age cliff. We saw, this is a really good article from Ryan Heath talking about age cliffs and age curves. And you can see he is now heading into year 9, and that's when you see a very steep decline there, which is coming for Derrick Henry. Now, he is an alien. He has definitely fought off the age thing for a while here, but it's in the range of outcomes. And I'll also say another thing that's in the range of outcomes is he's coming off a year where he split 50% of the snaps with Tyjae Spears. Now, the Ravens don't have a Tyjae Spears, but it wouldn't shock me if they didn't want to give him 300-plus touches. This is a team that struggled in the playoffs with Lamar Jackson at this point. In a meaningless Week 15 against the Giants, why give Derrick Henry 30-plus carries, right? Like we're talking about fantasy playoffs there or games where they're just blowing out their opponents. Why give Derrick Henry all that workload, right? I imagine they're probably going to find someone like a Rasheen Ali or whatever to kind of chew clocks late in games because they want him to be healthy for the playoffs. So I don't really expect him to hit massive like touch counts or touch totals in these games. I think he'll be efficient. He always has been. But the upside has to be there with the massive touch upside because he doesn't give you anything in the receiving game. So a lot of things going on there. So for me, I have Matt RB11 and a guy, again, in home leagues I'm not really touching. Then we have our RB12, James Cook, who I really, really like. I'm starting to really come around on James Cook. We had last year, Ken Dorsey was OC for the Bills. He gets fired week 10 after the Denver Broncos game. From that point on, James Cook was an absolute fantasy stud, where he came out here in the 7 games with new OC, Joe Brady. He had 16.7 points per game. He was on pace for 49 receptions, 7 receiving touchdowns, 542 receiving yards, 280 rush attempts, 1,200 rush yards. And then the big downside of him is just 2 rushing touchdowns. But we now have a full season with James Cook. All they added was Ray Davis, who I guess can be the guy inside of the 5. But if James Cook can find himself like 5 rushing touchdowns and find himself actually in that role or secure that role or even just flirt with that role and give you like 6 rushing touchdowns, he could absolutely crush. But what I think the actual upside comes with James Cook is the receiving upside. Even if he doesn't get the goal line rushing role, I think he can still crush with the receptions. I know he was on a 49 reception pace last year, but that was with Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis. Now all they have is Dalton Kincaid, They have Curtis Samuel, Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakur. No one's really proven. And James Cook last year, it was like a stat I saw on Twitter, had a massive yards per out run on routes without Stephon Diggs last year. He was an absolute monster. So when we talk about James Cook in this offense this year, if he can get to 70 catches, 80-plus catches, which really wouldn't be all that shocking if they actually use him as a receiver and they were using him downfield for running back terms, like he's had one of the higher ADOTs since he came into the NFL, that's all really exciting. So we could see him get the receiving upside in a good offense that will score points with Josh Allen. They have a good offensive line. He has the upside if he does take over that inside the 5 short yardage role. It's all there for him, and he has the talent to do it. Last 2 years, he has had the best rushing yards over expected per attempt over those 2 years cumulatively. And then on top of that, Joe Brady's coaching history. He was, with Carolina, 54 catches for Christian McCaffrey in 10 games. Those were the 2 years where he was hurt. Then you had Clyde Edwards-Helaire on the LSU team. Joe Brady was the OC for that. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had 55 catches on a team with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. And then we had Kamara. He was the Saints coordinator, or like on the Saints staff for Kamara's 81 catch seasons in 2017 and 2018. So he has fed the running back in the receiving game. We could very much see that for James Cook in a good offense. He's already shown the efficiency. So I'm all over James Cook this season. Then our RB13 is Joe Mixon, who, as I click record, they signed Cam Akers. I got to be honest, off of like, I don't know if he tore his Achilles or his ACL at this point. I feel really bad for Cam Akers. He was a special player coming out of high school, special player coming out of college. I can't really say that him getting signed moves me at all in terms of my Mixon projection here. But I'm also starting to come around on Mixon, who has 50 or more catches in each of his last 2 years. And he finishes an RB1 in points per game last year, despite the Bengals offense underperforming and then also having like Joe Burrow get hurt and everything kind of fall apart because of that. He was still pretty damn good. Now, he has no competition as he goes to Houston. It's Dameon Pierce, who they preferred Devin Singletary to Dameon Pierce. And then behind that, I really couldn't tell you. And Houston right now is projected to be the 9th highest scoring offense according to Vegas. I think, like you guys saw in the wide receiver video, you guys thought I was crazy for having Diggs, Nico, Dell all very high. This offense could just go scorched earth, where CJ Stroud wins an MVP. They're like top 5 in scoring, or even like the highest scoring offense, and everybody eats. I could very much see that for Joe Mixon, where he's going to come out here, be the lead back, be the lead bell cow here, as a guy who over the last 4 years was an RB1 last year. 2 of those 4 years, he's had 16 or more points per game. 1 of those years, he had an 18-plus point per game season. So he can still give you that difference-making upside. He's going to be in a good offense. They have a good offensive line as well with Laramie Tunsil. And I know it feels like Joe Mixon's been around forever, but he's really not that old. He's only 28. And Ryan Heath has a good tweet here kind of breaking down age declines for elite running backs. He said, don't overpredict. Among running backs with multiple top 12 fantasy finishes in their careers, we're looking at until age 28, little to no production drop-off, which Joe Mixon, as an age 28 running back, that qualifies for him. So I don't think he's going to fall off a cliff at any point soon. He's in a good offense. He's in a good spot. He should get all the volume. So I do like Joe Mixon there. Then, at RB14, we have Josh Jacobs. Might seem low, but he's scary in terms of like fragility and falling off. This is a Green Bay Packers team that has had a good offense. So I do understand the point of wanting to draft Josh Jacobs, right? The Packers are a good offense. They have LaFleur. They've never finished outside of the top 15 in points scored under LaFleur. And they have been the second most efficient offense over that span. They have a solid offensive line. Jordan Love is coming into his own, but we have Josh Jacobs changing teams, coming off a historically bad efficiency season. He was at like minus 2.4 fantasy points over expected per game. That is terrible. Najee Harris, someone that has been notoriously underperforming his volume since his rookie year, has never even had an FPOE per game worse than minus 1. So we're talking about minus 2.4. We're talking terrible. Like, he was really, really bad last year. And now that we're into year 6, changing teams, I have a hard time predicting like this massive bounce back. Usually when you underperform your volume that bad this late into your career, you don't replicate or you don't just like bounce back out of nowhere. It's usually signs of decline. And Dwayne McFarland has a good tweet here where he breaks down when running backs change teams, it's been pretty brutal for running backs because he's talking about year-over-year signals. So I believe that that's probably just like R squared, or just like the correlation coefficient of all running backs in terms of points per game, rush attempts, routes, targets, and then splitting up into same team running backs and new team running backs. And usually for running backs going to new teams, the rush attempts, routes, targets, points per game, all changes much more than what it was before, which is a bad thing for Josh Jacobs. And with Jacobs, the only time that we've seen that real ceiling was when he hit 19 points per game in 2022, and that came on the back of 393 touches. LaFleur has never given a single running back more than 285 touches, and that was to Aaron Jones. I just have a tough time seeing how Josh Jacobs just absolutely crushes this year. I know that it's a better spot. I know it's a better offense, but you do have Marshawn Lloyd there, who they drafted on day 2. You do have the fact that he's coming off his worst season ever, changing teams in year 6 of his career. It's just a lot of red flags there for me to be as excited as other people are for Jacobs. Then after that, we have Rachaad White. I didn't really break down what this tier is, but these are just high-end RB2s. These are guys that are like almost luxury RB2s. And I will say, you guys know me. I do a lot of hero RB builds, so I'm not really drafting these guys as RB2s. They're more like RB1 and 0 RB builds, or not drafted at all. But we have Rachaad White at RB15. He feels a lot like a dead zone back, but I can't earnestly put him much lower. And I will say the reason that he's not completely a dead zone back is because he's heading into year 3. He has pass catching upside. He has juice as an athletic running back. So that's all going for him. But he was so inefficient last year between the tackles, which is really rare to see this kind of efficiency and then see him get a ton of carries again. He had the 2nd most carries, the 4th most receptions last year, still just the RB10 in points per game. So not efficient, and he didn't even crack 1,000 rushing yards despite having the 2nd most rushes in the NFL. And then in terms of his efficiency, 41st in elusiveness rating, 43rd in missed tackles forced per rush, 45th in explosive rush percentage, 48th in yards after contact per attempt, 50th in PFF rushing grade, 44th in rushing yards over expected per attempt. So pretty brutal. But the only running back that this team added was Bucky Irving, a sub 200-pound back on day 3 out of Oregon. He's fun. He has upside. I do think that he can be more annoying than you would think in terms of his usage with Rachaad White, but it's tough to earnestly say he's a bad pick and he needs to be much lower than this because, again, he does have youth. He does have like some upside, but I will say I do have concerns that with Canales gone, we could see Baker Mayfield not return back to his old form, but take a step back, and this entire offense kind of take a step back and be like a bottom 10 offense. That's the thing I'm most scared of when I'm drafting these Buccaneers is no Dave Canales. Is Baker going to go back to what he was in Carolina and be pretty brutal out there? We shall see. Then after that, we have Kenneth Walker. And I'd love to be higher on Kenneth Walker. I do think he's very talented. He's young. He has all the stuff that we want, but he doesn't catch passes. We are yet to have a season for him of over 30 receptions, which is those are like Nick Chubb numbers, which is essentially what he is. I think that's fine, but we also have Zach Charbonnet here squeezing him from both angles. We have new coaches across the board. So Pete Carroll's gone. They bring in McDonald from the Ravens staff. They bring in Ryan Grubb as the OC, who was with the Washington Huskies in college football, which is a really fun setup where it's going to be a fun offense. It's going to be college concepts. It's going to be a lot of passing, right? They were high in pass rate when he was there in Washington. They scored a lot of points, and that should open things up for Walker. But that also means is we now have 2 running backs, both drafted in the 2nd round, in a new regime who doesn't have any loyalty to either. And Kenneth Walker is tough because we want the high value stuff, right? When we talked about Kamara earlier, we want those 80 catches and those 10 plus touchdowns. That's what you need for those big running back seasons. Kenneth Walker, it's tough to see how he gets there because we have Zach Charbonnet, who's a bigger back and a better back in terms of short yardage situations. Kenneth Walker last year was bottom 5 in success rate. He's this boom bust runner where he takes a lot of bad carries where he'll lose yards, but then he also will rip some off for 80 yards. He's a very good pure rusher, but he's also very boom bust. And when it's 3rd and goal and 1 yard to go, you don't need the upside of Kenneth Walker. You can bring in Zach Charbonnet and just have him hit a hole, which I think is very much a possibility. And we look at their usage last year, we had inside the 5 attempts, Kenneth Walker actually had more than Zach Charbonnet there. But you have to remember, Zach Charbonnet was a rookie last year. He's going to get more volume in year 2. He's going to get more efficiency in year 2 just as he progresses and becomes better. And then also last year, he ran more routes than Kenneth Walker and had the long down and distance in the 2-minute drill snaps. So if he takes those over and he takes over the inside the 5 stuff and the short yardage work, then we're talking about an efficiency play between the 20s, which isn't all that good. Your upside is kind of like early career Josh Jacobs. I guess if you want to shoot for the fences, say Kenneth Walker is that good of a pure rusher, he can be like Nick Chubb and he can give you like an RB6 finish and half PPR because he's just that good. that's all there for him. But he does also have the upside that maybe Zach Charbonnet is not in favor with these coaches, and they only want to use one running back, which I believe Washington did last year with Jonah Coleman. That's all very likely as well, too, where they could just go, or no, not Jonah Coleman, the kid who, I don't know, he wears a hoodie on Washington. He got drafted, or no, I think he was like undrafted this year. But they did ride like one bell cow last year, Washington. That could be the case this year, and they could see Walker differently. Maybe they even think that Walker can catch passes. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. I do, as a whole, though, want to bet on the Seahawks offense. Again, the new offense coordinator, Geno, could take a step forward. JSN could take a step forward. We could see like a true monster season from DK Metcalf. So I'm all over this Seahawks offense. So that's why I'm not drafting on a Kenneth Walker, but RB16 to me is pretty fair. But after that, we just have our RB2s. These are guys that are fairly priced. You put them in your RB2 spot. Does it feel great? Not really. But that's just kind of the nature of what RB2s are and what they have been since the beginning of time. And first up here, it's tough. This tier is really tough. Everybody has their question marks. Everyone has their warts. And first up, we're getting Aaron Jones, who is coming off an injury-riddled season. He's 29 years old. He's changing teams. So kind of similar deal to Josh Jacobs, where he's now changing teams after a down year. And that's scary, right? I showed you that chart of running backs changing teams. But with Aaron Jones, I kind of want to go against it a little bit. And it's for two reasons. One being that the Vikings, of course, they had Ty Chandler. But if Ty Chandler was that good, they wouldn't have signed Aaron Jones. They wouldn't have brought Cam Akers over midseason. He is a day 3 pick. He has his role, but he is not going to be a featured back in the NFL, Ty Chandler. Then you also have the idea that Aaron Jones got a front-loaded contract. He went from the Packers to the Vikings, and in the division rival, he's going to have a chip on his shoulder. He's going to want to ball out. It's kind of like with Saquon. I think that there's like a lot of animosity, Giants to Eagles, Packers to Vikings. A lot of animosity, a lot of reason to want to play this year, and probably like a last dance situation where they probably give you one last good year, and then it's tough to really expect anything else. And with Aaron Jones, he landed in a Kevin O'Connell offense, which, yes, is going to have Sam Darnold, and it's going to have J.J. McCarthy. I believe Sam Darnold, I didn't look this up, but I believe when he was in Carolina, he was actually great in terms of checking the ball down to McCaffrey. Feel free to fact check me on that, but we do know rookie quarterbacks love to check it down to their running backs. They're going to have J.J. McCarthy, and Kevin O'Connell hasn't used running backs with his time in Minnesota, but they have had just like inefficient Dalvin Cook and like bad Alexander Madison. We haven't seen what it looks like when he features a running back, and that could really happen here where Aaron Jones, we have no TJ Hawkinson. We don't know what's going to happen with Addison's like weird DUI thing. I'm not really expecting much, but Aaron Jones could be a focal point of this offense where he's scoring the touchdowns in close. He's getting involved in the passing game. And we've seen he doesn't need 20-plus touches to be efficient. So that's why I think that his game is going to age well. And last year, he didn't really show any signs of slowing down. Despite having a down year, it was really just because he underperformed his touchdowns. He was expected for about 7 on PFF. He only scored 3. But when we look at his game logs, he was actually an absolute monster last year, where in his final 5 games, he had 100-plus rushing yards in all of them. And we look down at his season grades on PFF, he had his second highest rushing grade on PFF since 2022, but it was his second highest ever in his career in terms of rushing grade. So they don't think he's lost a step. He finished the season on a high note. And again, before that, he had some down games. You have to remember, he was like battling a hamstring where he would come into a game and he'd come out early. So there's definitely a lot of risk with Aaron Jones here, right? Where he could be washed, right? The age cliff could have already came and went. He could get injured again for like the 3rd season in a row. Or he could be the focal point of a Kevin O'Connell offense with something to prove, and that is really interesting to me because, again, these running backs are kind of yucky in this tier, which brings us to Alvin Kamara at RB18, and it's hard to put him lower. Now, I will say he has some things working against him. Right now, he's in like this weird contract dispute where I think like this year of his deal, it's not guaranteed. He could only make $2 million this year, but he's like due for like 16, and there's a struggle with the Saints. So that's very much in play. We'll just monitor that. And if it's a real thing where he could hold out or not be on the Saints anymore, he would move way down. But if he plays for the Saints this year, this is a guy who was an absolute workhorse last year with 18.5 expected points per game. This is EP, right? Expected points just based on your volume, red zone usage, all of that. Now, I will say he was inefficient, right? Minus 0.6. So that wasn't that bad, right? That was, Josh Jacobs was way worse. Austin Eckler was way worse. Tony Pollard on the bottom of the screen was way worse. And he was efficient in the receiving game. He led all running backs with 9.5 receiving EP. You can see at the very end there. And he was actually at plus 0.4 receiving fantasy points over expected per game. So still one of the best receiving backs in the game. Had a ton of volume last year. That's going to come down, but it's still going to be a guy who's going to challenge for 15 plus points per game, have maybe, pretty much a lock that if he plays all 17 games, he'll be top 3 in targets or receptions for running backs. And they bring in new OC, Clint Kubiak. He's from the Shanahan tree. I believe that he was the 49ers maybe like passing game coordinator last year. He was like involved in that tree. He OC'd for the Vikings one single year. This should at the very least be a more modern offense. If he comes from the Shanahan tree where there should be motion and play action and more efficiency, and you're going to have teams definitely empty the box a bit for guys like Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed who win downfield, and that's all good for Kamara. Now, you're going to see Kendre Miller be in the mix, take a lot of touches away, but that's not all that concerning for a guy in Kamara that never won on volume. I know he did last year, but he doesn't need 1,000 rushing yards to pay off. He just needs his 70-plus catches, and he can get there for you. Kind of like, like late career Austin Eckler is kind of like an upside case for Kamara, but I definitely do get the idea of wanting to just fade him completely. We have the weird contract stuff. He's at the end of his prime at this point. So there's a lot going against Kamara, but for me, it's tough to rank the guy last year who was top 3 in volume and like a top 5 running back in point per game much lower than this. Then RB19 is David Montgomery, who's such a tough one to wrestle with in terms of just his archetype in fantasy. He's behind Gibbs in this offense, but even still, last year he finishes the RB15 in points per game, and the Lions were a backfield that led the entire NFL in expected points per game to the running back position. So this is an offense that uses their running backs a ton. They have maybe the best offensive line in football. They're going to score a ton of points, and they just got better on defense, where they draft 2 corners straight away with Terrion Arnold and Ennis Rakestraw. They bring in DJ Reader for the defensive line. They bring in Marcus Davenport, Carlton Davis. Should be a much better defense. The situation's amazing. And if Gibbs was to go down, David Montgomery would be a top 5 play in any given week. So he's someone that's like a low-end RB2 that you can play every week just because of the touchdown upside and the upside of this offense. And then also if Gibbs was to go down, he has that second gear of being really good. Then at RB20, we have Ramondre Stevenson, who is interesting. The Patriots are projected right now to be a bottom 5 offense, which is why it's tough to put him much higher because he's really more of a volume-based play than he is scoring upside. It's kind of like a PPR play, which is all fine. That's kind of just what you're doing in this RB2 area. But the Patriots really like him. They just signed him 4 years, $36 million contract under this new regime with Gerard Mayo, and $17 million guaranteed at the day of signing for that deal. Was the 7th highest among running backs in the NFL. So they really like Ramondre Stevenson, and the upside is there. He's been top 12 in target share as a running back the last 2 years in fantasy football. He was the RB10 in points per game just a year ago in 2022. Now, again, Patriots offense is rough. Offensive line is rough. But they do have some upside here if Drake May can kind of be like this year's CJ Stroud. I'm not saying that he will be, but that is in his upside case. And then they also bring in new OC, Alex Van Pelt, who's been with the Browns. And he's been with the Browns since 2020. And since 2020, the Browns have had fantasy studs with Nick Chubb. And they even had that year where Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt were both good. So they should have fantasy points to the running back. He should be able to get there in the receiving game. And this offense could be sneaky better than expected if Drake May surprises in year 1. But Antonio Gibson is there. He should be annoying in a similar way to Zach Charbonnet. And then also if this offense sucks, you're just going to have empty touches in a garbage offense, and that could be very frustrating. But after that, we have Najee Harris at RB21. Najee is coming off, honestly, his not his best season, obviously, for fantasy, but his most efficient season and his most explosive season. Najee Harris is coming off of, and we have the Pittsburgh Steelers here investing in the offensive line. They get Zach Frazier, they get Troy Fatanu. They use both of their first and second round picks on interior offensive line, or just offensive line in general. Broderick Jones was the guy they drafted the year before out of Georgia, who is running game skewed. So the offensive line is getting better. And they bring in Arthur Smith, who I know we don't like Arthur Smith, but when he just gets to play OC and just worry about his scheme, he's actually pretty good for fantasy football. Even last year, he was the only team up there in the mix of the Lions, the Dolphins, and the Niners, right? Some of the best run games in the NFL. he was up there in terms of usage for running backs. This is a chart from Hayden Wing. So he puts a lot of fantasy points towards the running backs, gives them a lot of touches. They improve the offensive line. And Arthur Smith, in his 5 years as an offensive coordinator or a head coach, 3 of those 5 years, he has been top 5 in rushing efficiency in terms of EPA per rush. So this is going to be a much more efficient run game. It's going to have a lot of volume. Russell Wilson should also be a much better quarterback that at least gives you the appearance of a vertical threat over guys like Kenny Pickett and Mason Rudolph. So I really like the idea of Najee Harris getting back into form and being really good. And then also, if Jaylen Warren was to miss any time, he would be, like Montgomery, elevated to like a top 12 running back in fantasy. Then at RB22, we have James Conner. He's tough, man, because James Conner, if they didn't draft Trey Benson, would be at the top of this tier at worst. But they draft Trey Benson in the 3rd round of the draft. He has a ton of juice, really good 40 time, size speed guy who catches passes, he runs the ball, he just pretty much do it all, has a lot of juice, a young guy that they used big draft capital on. So that's scary for James Conner. But last year, James Conner was like very good. He was top 6 in yards with the contact per attempt, elusiveness rating, explosive run percentage, PFF rush grade, missed tackles forced per touch. He was a monster. Then he was also at 15 plus points per game for his 3rd straight year, as I want to say like the RB13 last year in points per game. He was really good. And he's also in a great environment with the Cardinals, right, where you have a healthy Kyler Murray. And since Kyler was healthy last year from weeks 10 on, or just playing, I don't know about fully healthy, they were top 10 in offensive efficiency and EPA per play, and they had the 11th highest neutral run rate during that span. So they were efficient, and they wanted to run the ball. The only concerns for Conner at this point are age, right, falling off the age cliff at this point in time, and then also, again, Trey Benson also being in that backfield. At what point does the baton get passed? If James Conner comes out slow, does Trey Benson eventually win that job? What does it look like in terms of the receiving splits and the goal line splits? There's a lot there in terms of uncertainty with a guy like Trey Benson added into the mix. Then our last running back in this tier, Jaylen Warren at RB23. Pretty similar deal to Najee Harris. To me, it feels a lot like the Tony Pollard to Najee Harris's Zeke Elliott. They both ended up finishing like top 24 in points per game that year, where it was like very clear that they just passed each other. And I think there's going to be plenty of offense to go around. Again, we have that chart with Arthur Smith. He uses running backs a ton. There's going to be volume for both of these running backs. Najee, more of your between-the-20s grinder with goal line looks, and then Jaylen Warren, your explosive big play back that's also going to get the receiving work. Both of those roles are good for fantasy. And again, they made the improvements with the offensive line. They made the improvements at quarterback. There should be more efficiency with this offense. And this is a guy in Jaylen Warren who led all running backs missed tackles forced per attempt last year. Super explosive pass catching back. And he kind of gives me, he could be the Gibbs to Najee Harris's Montgomery in this offense. So I think both guys are actually really good picks. And then again, they can both be like fringe RB2s and then also give you top 12 upside if the other was to go down. If Najee was to go down or Warren was to go down, they would both be league winners. Then we have our fringe RB2s. These are guys like, I guess you could call them RB2s. I guess you're taking them in 0 RB builds as your RB2 or maybe a hero RB build and really punting the position. And look, again, it gets pretty ugly here, but we will throw DeAndre Swift out. He just signed with the Bears for 3 years, $24 million, $14 million guaranteed, 9th in the NFL. So they gave him a lot of money. Now, people fell into that trap with Miles Sanders last year. So I don't want to do the same thing, but that's a pretty big investment for a running back here. And last year was the RB24 in points per game, and it was a weird spot where Hurts took all the goal line attempts and then also didn't check the ball down a lot. So he actually had his first season in the NFL outside the top 10 in target share among running backs. So that should come back up. He should get more target share, more targets, which is huge for Swift. That's how Swift won early, right? He was a guy where he wasn't going to give you 1,200 rushing yards or 20-plus carries per game. He was going to give you a ton of catches, and that's how he won early on in his career. We should see a return to that, which is really good. Then he's also in a Bears offense that seems ugly on the surface, but with that Connor Allen tweet, he actually has Chicago projected to be the 16th highest scoring team in the NFL. So that's actually really good. That's ahead of teams like the Colts, the Chargers, the Seahawks, the Cardinals. I don't know. I feel like I said the Cardinals twice, but Tampa, Minnesota, like all these teams that are like pretty solid. Chicago's supposed to be a pretty good offense. They're supposed to score a good amount of points, and DeAndre Swift will be the favorite or the clubhouse leader to be the lead back in what should be an improving offense. the pass catching back, and potentially even get the goal line work. So that's all out in front of him. Of course, he could be Miles Sanders, where he gets the rug pulled and Khalil Herbert comes for his job, and Khalil Herbert has been a really good running back in the past. Roschon Johnson's interesting too on passing down. So lots of ways for this to go wrong, but we're in a section of running backs here where things could go wrong for everybody. But when we're in this section, I want to shoot for upside, and that's Jonathan Brooks. Now, he's somebody right now that is slipping in drafts, and I wouldn't, don't pay yesterday's price on Jonathan Brooks. Don't pay this price on Jonathan Brooks. Take him wherever he falls here, because he gets put on the PUP list and everyone's going to freak out. But we have Jeff Mueller here. He is the injury analyst over at 4for4. The tweet is Adam Schefter saying that Jonathan Brooks is on the PUP, and Jeff Mueller comes out and says Jonathan Brooks is essentially on PUP to start the camp as expected. Would expect his timeline to be cleared for football activity early August, active week 1 with slow ramp up in weeks 1 through 4, lead back in majority volume weeks 4 through 8, workhorse weeks 9 through 18. This is a guy that they drafted in the second round. He is a really good running back prospect. He is the best in this class. He catches passes. He's 6 foot, 215 pounds. He also has the aspect of Breece Hall, where we wanted to bet on Breece Hall post ACL tear because he was young and athletic. Well, we don't have the combine testing for Jonathan Brooks, but we have a pretty good idea that he's a good athlete. He was only 20 years old when he was drafted. Today, Sunday, July 21st, is actually his birthday. So he just turned 21 today. He is very young. He's coming off an ACL tear that wasn't that late in the season. It should be a good amount of time to recover. And if he can be a guy where the Carolina Panthers now have Dave Canales, who made Rachaad White a top 12 running back last year, we can now get Jonathan Brooks in that same role as the season goes on, and he's finally given that workhorse role, which he should, right? They only have Chuba Hubbard behind him and then Miles Sanders, so they're very much saying, hey, when Jonathan Brooks is ready to go, he will be our RB1. That's all there in front of him, and I know that the Carolina Panthers don't look sexy, but with Dave Canales, he can bring them out of the dumpster again, like he did with the Bucs last year, like he did with the Seahawks the year before that, and Jonathan Brooks could be the big winner there. As a guy who's an all-purpose back, he caught over 20 passes in his final year despite having it cut short due to the ACL tear. The ACL tear happened a good while ago, to the point where he should be ready to go early in the season, then maybe even take on a big workload down the stretch. So I do like the idea of Jonathan Brooks. I will say, if you draft him, you definitely want to have a contingency plan. He's a guy that you draft if maybe you took a Najee or you took a David Montgomery, like a high floor volume play, because you can't really bank on him cracking your lineup until like week 5, week 6, week 7. So he's someone you have to play in a smart way, depending on your roster construction in fantasy. Now, that is going to do it for us today. You guys can see the entirety of the top 25 here. I'll just leave it here. As always, if you want my entire rankings, I will say this is going up Sunday night. Monday morning, I'm going to do a rankings update for my underdog rankings. So you can go to patreon.com/Ron Stewart. There you can find my rankings, and you can upload them straight to Underdog from Google Sheets, and it'll be my rankings in your Underdog app. As always, if you're not an Underdog as well, you might as well. Promo code RON will get you a deposit match up to $250. You'll have a link in the description and the comment section down below. You click it, it'll take you to Underdog Fantasy. It'll use promo code RON. It'll match your first deposit up to $250, and you can use my rankings over on Underdog. As always, I appreciate you guys watching. Like, subscribe, and I will see y'all in the next one.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold, oh, ice around my body like I'm